So this is the class before the class on Lycidas. Poetry inspires us. We admit that, and it keeps us alive, and we admit that. And this is a poem that inspires me. It's a weird poem. I mean, it's weird to even say that because it's a Christian poem about the death of one of Milton's friends at Cambridge. It wasn't even his friend. There was just a volume that was put together. The guy died at sea. And the imagery is all, I mean, it's classical, as we'll see. It's Christian, it's Hebraic. I mean, it's primarily Christian. It's muted, but they're really not muted. It's muted in its being absolutely fully Christian. But it is a poem about mourning and memory. Here's just a coming attraction. The first 16 lines. It's one of the great opening lines of any poem. Yet once more, O ye laurels, and once more ye myrtles brown with ivy never sere, I come to pluck your berries harsh and crude, and with forced fingers rude shatter your leaves before the mellowing year. Bitter constraint and sad occasion dear compels me to disturb your season dew, for Lycidas is dead. Dead ere his prime, young Lycidas, and hath not left his peer. Who would not sing for Lycidas? He knew himself to sing and built the lofty rhyme. He must not float upon the watery bier unwept, and welter to the parching wind without the meed of some melodious tear. Begin then, sisters of the sacred well, that from beneath the seat of Jove doth spring. Begin, and somewhat loudly sweep the string, hence with denial, vain and coy excuse. So may some gentle muse with lucky words favor my destined urn, and as he passes turn and bid fair peace be to my sable shroud. For we were nursed upon the self-same hill, fed the same flock by fountain, shade, and rill. I could keep on going. Wow, it's incredible. I mean, you get a sense of this poetry which is focused on loss and the way in which Milton is asking a question about whether poetry can compensate for loss. It's really, in a way, what the poem is about. Can poetry compensate for loss? And that becomes even more acute in the second stanza that I read, in which he imagines his own death. Of course, this is Milton again placing himself in the center of everything, but he's imagining his death and wondering if someone will remember him. Just a crazy poem, right? How old is he? 29? Here's the handout. So you can all go back to, cleaning your kitchens or whatever. So that's the coming attraction, meaning that's the coming attraction for next week or for when we're meeting. Here's a little bit more background. One of the things that I might write about if I were not so obsessed with more present things like plague, is the way in which 18th century critics and poets consistently misread 17th century poets. It's really instructive about not only the 18th century, but also about the 17th century. Meaning you can better understand 17th century poetry by seeing the way in which 18th century people misread it. So, I mean, some of you have seen that I've been interested, we might have talked about this in classes together if you had me as undergraduates, the way in which Dr. Johnson misreads Donne, and how we in the end decided that Johnson is the great way of actually figuring out what Donne is up to through his misreading. We'll come to Johnson, I think, on the sheet. But there was a sense, and we're focusing on Milton here, but you'll hear echoes of Johnson's critique of Donne. So Johnson writes in the Life of Milton, he doesn't like this poem. In this poem, there is no nature, for there is no truth. There is no art, for there is nothing new. Wow, right? No nature, it's a poem about, I mean, it's full of nature with no truth, no art for his nothing. I don't even know why he's going nuts here. Its form is that of a pastoral, easy, vulgar, and therefore disgusting. It's almost as if he wrote this for my class. I mean, meaning it's so exaggerated. Its form is that of a pastoral, easy, vulgar, and therefore disgusting. Whatever images it can supply are long exhausted, and its inherent improbability always forces dissatisfaction on the mind. I mean, I think when we read the whole poem together, I have to think of what is he talking about? Its images, I guess, are cliched. It's already been done. Pastoral's been done. It's exhausted. The vulgarity we'll get to. Oh, there's a lot more here. He continues. Among the flocks and copses and flowers appear the heathen deities, Jove and Phoebus, Neptune and Aeolus, with a long train of mythological imagery, such as a college usually supplies. Johnson's basically saying Milton's showing off. I mean, he learned all this stuff in school. He crammed it all into his poem, and he's showing off. It's like when you write an essay and you put in, we're in class, just overdoing it. This poem has yet a grosser fault. With these trifling fictions are mingled the most awful and sacred truths, such as ought never to be polluted with such irreverent combinations. The shepherd likewise is now a feeder of sheep, and afterwards an ecclesiastical pastor, a superintendent of a Christian flock. Such equivocations are always unskillful, but here they are indecent and at least approach to impiety, of which, however, I believe the writer not to have been conscious. How weird. So Blake, as we'll see, I never thought of this before. Blake says later that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. And here's an earlier version of that. Milton simply didn't know how bad a poet he was, or how inappropriate a poet he was. You see, that's 18th century, just fascinating. And I always thought the 18th century was boring because it's so polite and civilized, which is kind of boring, right? But if you read people like Johnson and Addison wrote The Spectator, this collection of essays, like the first journal in a way, like the New Yorker for the 18th century, but with very few authors. They are creating this culture of politeness, and they're doing it out of a great fear and anxiety and apprehension of the possibility of things being otherwise. And Milton, for Addison and for Johnson, much for Addison, it's coming at the beginning of the 18th century. The revolution of the mid-16th, 17th century is still very much in people's mind. Milton is a figure for that in some ways, his being at the head of the regicide, at the head of the killing of the king. So Milton is very much part of that project, or he's very much the thing that has to be kind of pushed off. I mean, Addison is more interesting because Addison writes 18 essays. It's a fascinating thing, really. He writes 18 essays about Paradise Lost, in which he's really trying to control the poem. And he's trying to control the poem in the name of this new politeness. Like he's trying to save the poem, to salvage the poem for an audience that rejects Milton's religious enthusiasm. That's what they called it then. We might call it fanaticism, fundamentalism, although Milton was very far from being a fundamentalist in any simple terms. But that's how they would have thought of Milton, and Addison in a way brings Milton back. Here Johnson is just pushing him off. He doesn't like this. This is what a cognitive scientist, a friend of mine, calls a category violations, right? That Milton is mixing up awful truths with fictions. Christ is an ecclesiastical, a superintendent of Christian flock, a shepherd, a pastor. You can't do that. You can't call, even though the Bible is full of this stuff, right? You can't, and the Bible really is much more of a 17th century sensibility than an 18th century one. There's the mixing of registers all the time in the Bible. Moses is a shepherd. Moses is the leader of the Jewish people, and Jesus as well, and all the Avot as well. So he finds this all to be indecent. And of course, we can hear echoes of the Cowley essay. Remember that? Let's just read this about wit. If by a far more noble and more adequate conception that be considered wit, which is at once natural and new, that which, though not obvious, is upon its first production acknowledged to be just. If it be that which he that never found it wonders how he missed, to wit of this kind of metaphysical poets have seldom risen. Their thoughts are often new. Let's really start here. Let me just ask the person next door to turn off that whatever. Avital? Avital? Can you take that phone call elsewhere, please? Thank you. Wow, it's just so loud. It's just so loud. Can you turn whoever that is down, please? So go on the porch. I'm trying to make a video. Okay, sorry. And we're back. So here, their thoughts are often new, but seldom natural. They are not obvious, but neither are they just. This idea of things being just. And the reader, far from wondering that he missed them, wonders more frequently by what perverseness of industry they were ever found. It's kind of like poetic virtuoso, which goes, it's too far over the top. Who would think of comparing levers and compasses? But wit, abstracted from its effects upon the hearer, may be more rigorously and philosophically considered as a kind of discordant harmony, a combination of dissimilar images, or discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. As I pointed this out to you before, and I think I'm the only one who points it out, and this is an often quoted passage, is that Johnson right here gets metaphysical poetry exactly right, meaning in that one clause, or discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. Everything up until this point is Johnson talking about the way in which the poet takes things that don't belong together and invents an artificial connection between them. Invents, not discovers. But here for this one phrase, Miltonists around the world, or Johnsonians, tell me what you think of this. Here, Johnson gets metaphysical poetry exactly right, or discovery of occult resemblances, hidden resemblances in things apparently unlike. He could be Thomas Browne right here. He could be Thomas Browne, who's a contemporary of Donne, who is more prosaic than that. He writes prose. And this is kind of a description that we would not be surprised not to see it itself in Browne, but to see it enacted in Browne in the same way that it's enacted in Donne. Occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. The poet is not an inventor, but a discoverer. But the rest of Johnson is looking at Johnson not as a discoverer, but as an inventor of wit, thus defined. They have more than enough. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for illusions, comparisons and illusions. For illustrations, comparisons and illusions. Their learning instructs and their subtlety surprises. It's going back to what Johnson says about Milton. You're really showing off your learning, but the reader commonly thinks his improvement dearly bought, and though he sometimes admires, is seldom pleased. Okay. That's a nice background for Lycidas, meaning we'll be thinking about how does Johnson get this poem so wrong? I'm not in my library at the university, but there have been two books published about this poem. That is, two books of collections of essays, meaning Johnson notwithstanding, critics and other poets for hundreds of years have come back to Lycidas. It pulls them into it. And so that's the testimony of a tradition of critics saying that, well, Johnson is missing something, or he's misreading. I mean, and his misreadings, like many of the misreadings of the 18th century, of the 17th century, are very interesting. Other misreadings are my personal favorite, and one I've worked on as a scholar, is Richard Bentley's 1732 edition of Paradise Lost. Bentley was the best classicist of his generation, and he was producing, again, this effort to, as a good friend of mine, Peter Herman, says, to domesticate Milton. And he tries to do this by, I mean, Milton is turned into a classic in 1995 with this very expensive, big, widely sponsored edition of Paradise Lost, which is trying to disassociate Milton's reputation as Milton's reputation as a poet from Milton's reality as a regicide. So that was a major attempt and a success in doing that. And the book Paradise Lost became a book that everybody read, often on Sundays. But there were certain problems with Milton's, with the metaphysics of Paradise Lost, and by extension, the politics. We don't often think of the connection between metaphysics and politics, but there is, even for us, and in Malcolm Harach, we don't have time to go through it here, the way in which metaphysics always informs politics. So what do I mean here? What do I mean by that? That in Paradise Lost, as we'll see together, Milton's angels eat. And it's not an accident, and it's not a mistake, and Milton goes so far as to say so. I'm not just glossing things as theologians here, or I'm not going to provide the gloss that theologians, including rabbinic commentaries, will say that the angels, when they visited Abraham, didn't really eat, they faked it, right? Milton's angels really eat. And that's, for Milton, that shows it's in a poetic way of rendering his metaphysics, which are, in very, very short, and it's a very complicated discussion, is that there is a continuity between spirit and matter, and that which is against earlier Catholic dualisms and will be against later philosophical dualisms. That is, where later the philosophical ones are easier and relevant, especially when we're talking about 18th century misreadings of 17th century poetry. The 18th century saw that the philosophical inheritance that really comes from Descartes is that mind and body are separate. Now that has political ramifications. And we'll talk about those, but what's Milton's assumption that mind and body come together, and they're not, Milton here is flirting with Spinoza, but not being Spinoza, and that's another discussion. But there's a kind of continuity between what Milton and Spinoza are doing. The suggestion that there is a continuity between spirit and matter suggests also there's more of a connection between the divine and the human. And if there's more of a connection between the divine and the human, then people can claim to be inspired. And through their inspiration, they can claim through their inspiration, their enthusiasm, to transform the political realm. On the one hand, that's very inspiring. On the other, when people claim to be inspired by the divine, they take upon themselves certain decisions and authority that a hierarchical 18th century society would not tolerate. Meaning Milton will acknowledge the divine in man. I mean, you see it's two-sided. Acknowledging the divine in man opens up human potential, but it also opens up the possibility for the human misuse of power. So then the two sides are 18th and 17th century. The misuse is the 18th century. The 17th century is Milton's, is this potential, the divine potential that everyone has within it. So when Milton makes his angels eat, when he violates those category assumptions, he is undermining implicitly, and he's not aware of it, but he is undermining the 18th century emphasis on dualism and hierarchy. So Bentley, on the one hand, loves Paradise Lost. It's the greatest poem ever, but he wants to make it safe for a dualist, hierarchical, more authoritarian world. And he does that by claiming that Milton's, the poem that we have inherited from Milton is corrupted. It was corrupted by his printers. It was corrupted by an editor. Sometimes I think he blames his daughters who who took things down improperly. He blames all of them. And he provides emendations which show what Milton really said, what he really said. It's a weird exercise in intellectual history because everybody knows Johnson can't really be serious. Even though he does it all with a straight face. But what he's doing is transforming or turning the poem into a poem that this 18th century culture of politeness could tolerate, could read. And doing that, he was domesticating the energy of Paradise Lost. So that's, I mean, we've gone a little far afield. We were talking before about, we started with, and this is where we'll pick up. Let's read one more stanza just to end. We'll pick up in our discussion. We'll talk about Lycidas. This did come at the end of the 1645 volume. Let's read one more stanza. Remember, he's now invoked he's invoked his lost friend, and he's also imagined his own death. Together both, ere the high lawns appeared under the opening eyelids of the morn, we drove afield. And both together heard what time the gray fly winds her sultry horn, battening our flocks with fresh dews of night, off till the star that rose at evening bright toward heaven's descent had sloped his westering wheel. Meanwhile, the rural ditties were not mute, tempered to the open flute. Rough satyrs danced, and fawns with cloven heel from the glad sound would not be absent long. And old Demetis loved to hear our song, but oh, the heavy change. Now thou art gone, and never must return. Thee, shepherd, thee the woods and desert caves with wild thyme and gadding vine o'ergrown, and all their echoes mourn, the willows and the hazel copses green shall now no more be seen, fanning their joyous leaves to thy soft lays, as killing as the canker to the rose, or taint worm to the weanling herds that graze, or frost to flowers that their gay wardrobe wear when first the white morn blows. Such, Lycidas, thy loss to shepherds ear. Where were ye, nymphs, when the remorseless deep closed o'er the head of your loved Lycidas? That's the beginning of the next stanza, where Milton again is meditating on the possibility of poetry as consolation. And he's now calling out to the classic, the pagan nymphs. You see what Johnson's getting at when he doesn't like the pastoral. There's nothing there. It's really, it's very far from being a full description. You know, we've read Marlowe, and we don't get any, and we've read Raleigh. We don't get any of the fullness of the pastoral environment, its specificity. We drove afield, and both together heard what time the gray fly winds her sultry horn, battening our flocks with the fresh dews of night. It's, I mean, in a way, it's just kind of generic, beautiful but generic. So here, we'll stop here. But we're when in reading Lycidas, Milton is raising the question of mourning, of death, of memory, of consolation. What more could you want to read these days? So I'll be in touch with you about when we're having class.